Apollo 13 was to be the first truly scientific-oriented lunar landing mission. The commander of the mission, who was veteran not only of 2 Gemini flights, but the Apollo 8 lunar orbit flight, Jim Lovell, put on the mission patch that you see on the upper right the motto Ex Luna Scientia, from the moon knowledge. This was an adaptation of the Navy's motto, from the sea knowledge. And Lovell was very conscious of the fact that this was a science-oriented mission, the fact that it wasn't enough to just land on the moon or even to land at the chosen target, but it was becoming more and more about what you did after you got there, and in particular scientific exploration. Apollo 13 was the first mission that was targeted to not one of the vast lava seas or maria, but one of the highland areas of the moon. And this was a whole new kind of scenario for the scientists to study. And there would be other experiments on Apollo 13 that had not been done before, including a battery-powered lunar drill. And Lovell and his lunar module pilot, rookie Fred Hayes, were very excited about digging into that. They worked with geologists to train for their activities on the moon. And the command module pilot was a rookie named Ken Mattingly. And he was pursuing a very ambitious program of scientific observation and photography from lunar orbit, also working with geologists to prepare for that role. Well, everything seemed to be going great until literally the week before launch. And they discovered that the crew had been exposed to a case of German measles, as you will find out reading in the book. And also, if you've ever seen the movie Apollo 13, which is largely very accurate. And Mattingly was the only one who didn't have immunity. And so just a few days before the scheduled launch, Mattingly was bumped from the crew and replaced with his backup, Jack Swigert, who was a very competent astronaut, of course, but nevertheless a shattering blow to Ken Mattingly, and a very distressing move also for Lovell and Hayes. They had very intensive sessions with Swigert in the simulators to make sure that they could mesh as a crew. And here you see them the day before launch. And you can maybe tell from this picture that these guys are a little bit stunned at this point to be going through this, but nevertheless ready for their mission. Well, they lifted off on April 11th, 1970, and everything went well, as you all know, I'm sure, from the movie, and if you've read the book, read the chapter. They had an explosion on the spacecraft at 55 hours and 55 minutes into the flight when Apollo 13 was 200,000 miles out in space. At first, Mission Control wasn't sure whether it was faulty instrumentation, but the reports from the astronauts convinced them that this was no false instrumentation. This was a real problem, a serious problem. Of course, famous transmission from Apollo 13, Houston, we've had a problem. And that was an understatement. What had happened was an oxygen tank in the service module of Apollo 13's command service module, which was called Odyssey, had exploded. And you'll get the details of why that happened from the chapter. But that crippled the entire command service module, forced the astronauts to go into the lunar module, Aquarius, where they spent the remainder of the flight using the lunar module's supplies, its power supply, its radio, its computer, its oxygen, and especially its rocket engines, to change its course, to change Apollo 13's course to swing around the moon and head home towards Earth without landing on the moon, without even going into lunar orbit. Well, that was, of course, a tremendous ordeal for both the astronauts and for everybody in mission control, struggling to come up with procedures to help those guys deal with every problem that came up and to get home. And there was tremendous ingenuity that was involved in doing that. And I think that's one of the most compelling aspects of the Apollo 13 story, is the ingenuity that took place both in space and on Earth to solve these crises, literally one after another. And one of them was the fact that the lunar module did not have enough air purification canisters to support 3 astronauts for 4 days. It was only supposed to support 2 astronauts for a couple of days. Enough time to get them down to the surface of the moon, let them do a couple of moonwalks, a night's rest, and get back up into lunar orbit. Well, now you had 3 astronauts living in the lunar module for all of those 4 days that it took to get home. And so they had to adapt the command module's purification canisters, which were a different shape. They were square instead of round, so you were trying to put a square peg in a round hole, literally. And they figured out how to do that with just materials on board the spacecraft. And they radioed up instructions to the crew. And you can see the main picture is Deke Slayton standing there with this purifier in a kind of a jury-rigged setup to attach it to the lunar module's environmental control system, and holding the air hose there, the feed hose to the purification canister, is Bob Gilruth. Sitting next to him is Chris Kraft with the dark glasses. And they're all looking at this thing, which is about to be, the instructions are about to be sent up to the astronauts. On the upper left corner, you see the assembled canister in place on the lunar module as photographed by the astronauts, and it looks exactly like the one that had been developed by the technicians and engineers on the ground and was assembled by the astronauts using the instructions radioed up from Earth. So just an incredibly inspiring story of how they did that, but no less inspiring and no less compelling is the story of the astronauts themselves, obviously, in the spacecraft trying to make it through this ordeal, mostly without power, trying to find new procedures, to use the new procedures that Mission Control was sending up, all kinds of unorthodox things, like the way they had to align the spacecraft on one of their rocket firings without a benefit of the computer alignment. And here you see Jim Lovell and Jack Swigert in that very tiny cabin of Aquarius, the lunar module. Swigert is looking through the reentry checklist, which of course was going to have to be heavily modified so that the astronauts could do it with the situation they had. Not only that, but it got very cold, and that made it even more of an ordeal. And so when the astronauts finally splashed down and were recovered successfully, you can see this tremendous celebration in Mission Control. And in fact, as you see the quote at the bottom from Tom Stafford, he says, "The finest hour, in my viewpoint, of the space program was getting Apollo 13 back, not the first lunar landing." And so you can see that, and that's how many, many people feel, that Apollo 13's recovery was in fact NASA's finest hour. Well, here you see the astronauts being welcomed back. They're in Hawaii, and they're being greeted by President Nixon, and they've been decorated by the president. But this is a scene that is a little bit deceptive, because at this moment, Nixon was cutting back NASA's funding, and the last couple of Apollo flights had already been canceled, and one more would be canceled in the summer of 1970, or I should say one had already been canceled and 2 more would be canceled that summer, I think it is. In any case, the last 3 landings were on the chopping block, and space advocates were very upset about this, but this was Apollo's changing fortunes. We'll pick up with Apollo 14 in the next section.